So we're doing burgers and dogs.
Yeah.
Start covering here.
Awesome.
Yeah, we'll have to go.
That's kind of what we're thinking.
I have my 3 burners going, so I'm gonna have a big griddle. Put it on there. Yeah, no doubt.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, other than that square. Oh, pretty quick.
I'm working 6 a.m. to 2 p.m.
Yeah, I wanted something other than wild.
Yeah. Damper on the trip.
How'd your winter go? Good. Busy. I didn't get much ice fishing. I got too busy, so I spent way too much time every day on the computer reading legislators. I'll be really glad when that. Yeah, like time for walking.
So,
exactly. Yeah, I got a little one. She starts following me. Really but someone's watching on ice and yeah. So anyway, we got to get going here. I gotta get up close so I can hear what's going on.
Oh, gotcha.
Mr. Sabine will get things going. Everybody, we haven't seen each other in person for a long time.
That's exciting. How are you doing this morning?
Waiting for some people that aren't here. Yeah, there are should be some here. Oh, you may be doing some song and dance routines or something. So.
Chris, when this starts,
Probably coming over.
Oh, gotcha.
He's over here a lot with the legislature. and Western Spots. He's been really kept on the bill. I'm sure he's tired of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's not too far. I mean,
Yeah.
every day.
You know, I was somebody out in California, drive, yeah. You know, he drives for 4 hours to get 3 minutes, and half the legislators aren't listening to you. Especially for the legislators from the flat. He did not send out a good one. He never did.
I don't think so.
Well, how things work. This is kind of a rebuilding that like 10, 12 years ago, the Federation was put on one of these. They were 100 or something. They were a big deal, and we got out of it. So this will be a little rebuilding process. It's a good program. We got some good talks. So it's got fun. Went over.
Update on avian. Because that was
I didn't realize that cancer spread found dead bears, mountain lions. Yes, yeah. They found rescues over on the Rocky Mountain front. Down in Wyoming. And that's just what people are finding. They're finding dead birds and Indians getting infected. It goes well beyond.
Good morning, everybody.
The high price.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's kind of scary. These waterfowl everywhere. I am not. See, it's crispy yet something to go. Little better, not very high. Find somebody that can crank that up.
Is it locked there?
Find somebody that works here. I'm with Flathead Wildlife, so membership lagged a little bit. Thanks for COVID. I picked up volunteered to be a membership board. Got 47 members now.
Nice. I would love to talk to you a little bit about it.
Oh, yeah. That maybe is better, Chris.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Should I go grab some?
About 500.
See if somebody here knows. I'm not a Navy guy at all.
She's supposed to be coming.
Definitely not a Navy I see the lights on, so it looks like it's. I can barely hear the song.
Oh, there you
That's
go.
better?
Yeah.
How's that? Is that good? Okay.
That's better.
Better?
Yeah. I'm not sure how it is in the back if they've got.
Yeah, it might be.
Can you guys hear me in the back?
They can, they stop talking. That's back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Taking up a good time.
Do you need to be closer to Sonia? Are you good? No, I'm okay. Thank you.
That's. I tried membership by doing a lot of projects, a lot of I put out a monthly newsletter and I'm friends and sharing that with folks. So.
Test, test, test.
Can you hear me in the back?
We have
You can't hear me at all? Yes, you have to be right up to the microphone.
Let me see.
I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. How was that? Is that better? You want to try it?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody to our wildlife conference here this morning from the Montana Wildlife Federation. It's good to see everybody. There's still some members that are on their way, and appreciate everybody showing up. Purpose of today's discussion is to kind of highlight some of the issues that we have interest in and be able to ask some of these speakers about these particular issues. And we will have a panel of legislators here after lunch. We'll be able to ask the legislators some advice on how to better communicate with the legislature, and we can ask them questions about what they think is going on at the legislature. And at the end of the day, we have an award ceremony at 4 o'clock. And several of the speakers here are going to be getting awards too. I see Doug Smith at the back of the room. Hi, Doug. How are you? Thanks for coming. So before we start, can we do a quick around the table and do a quick introduction here? Sonia, let's start with you, please. And by the way, we are being streamed live right now, so don't say anything bad. So.
That's true. Right here, guys. Hi, everyone. I know most of you, but I'm Sonia Smith, and I'm the communications director for MWF.
I'm Tanya Gates. I'm a newly elected board member, and I'm from Florence, Montana.
I'm Emily Cluess. I'm the membership coordinator from Helena.
I'm Jim Basho. I'm from Kalispell and president of Flathead Wildlife.
Skip Kowalski, I'm from Stevensville, and I'm the National Wildlife Rep in this group.
I'm Tom Bushel. I'm also from Stevensville and board member and past president.
Bruce Farley, I'm from Missoula, speaker today, retired former executive director of Montana Trout Unlimited.
I'm Tim Aldrich from Missoula, Montana, commissioner, and also from the past president.
John Salazar, board member, not originally, been in Livingston for 29 years and recently moved to Lolo.
I'm Glenn Ellison, a board member and a proud retiree.
I'm Pat Fire, former commissioner, and I work for Trout Unlimited.
Dave Dibloff, I'm on the staff of National Wildlife Federation based out of Missoula.
Dale Becker, I live in the Creston area. I don't really claim Kalispell per se. I spent 30 years or so working for the Confederate States Fishing Tribes and Wildlife Manager before I retired from years back.
Mike Mershon, I drove over from Billings this morning.
Oh,
Newly elected board member.
Kathy Hadley, board member. I live in
Sitting at the back there. Doug, let's start with you.
Doug Smith, retired wildlife biologist, Yellowstone National Park.
Frank Solasi of Missoula, the executive director of the Wildlife Federation.
Alan Charles, retired fishing game guy from Mouse City.
Arby Egbert, retired Fish Wildlife Parks, former board member, full-time board member. Alec Underwood, senior policy development.
All right, thanks everybody for showing up. We expect more people to show up later on today. So our first speaker is Bruce Barling, as he said. He was 24 years as Executive Director of Montana Trout Unlimited. He was formerly the Conservation Director of the Clark Fork Coalition, worked in various areas of wilderness management in Montana and Idaho. He's been recognized with several different awards. And in 2020, he was inducted into the Montana Hall of Fame, or the Outdoor Hall of Fame. So Bruce is going to talk to us about in-stream flow issues. Bruce.
Some of you guys who haven't seen in a while. Talk about the biological and the physical nuances of water and its relationship to our aquatic ecosystems, because I'm a science guy first and not that big on policy and law, but that was a lot of my job for a long time. You know, we're all familiar with sort of all these laws of yesteryear. 1872 mining law. In Montana, the fact that our state lands, we have this problem sometimes of we have to manage them only for school trust revenue. We've also got grazing fees on federal land that we have not been able to change for it seems like about 100 years, and a number of things like that. There's just all these old sort of statutes that we collectively as conservationists have been trying to change for years and have really only been able to sort of chip away at the edges and stuff. Think about all of those things, 1872 mining law, for just none of them are as tough enough to crack as Western water law. And in the state of Montana, that's essentially how we run things. Our laws and our administration of water in the state are based on the tenets of Western water law. Now, I'm going to give you a little background first before I talk about the problems with in-stream flow and actually all the things that we can still do to actually improve in-stream flows or protect what we have in terms of in-stream flows in this state. But first, I thought it would probably be helpful to sort of lay out some of the basics of water law in the state and also talk about it in the context of our state constitution. Every year, when we have really dry years like last year, it seems like almost every year, but probably 3 out of 5 years, we have problems with chronically dewatered streams in the state. And I used to get phone calls all the time from people, especially outfitters and guides. And I'd get, in August or in July, how come the rivers, blah, 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 how come we can't do something about it? How come the irrigators get all the water? Every single year. And I have to walk them through what the issues were, what the constraints were, basically what the impediments were for us to get water in stream for the aquatic communities and especially for the fish. And so let me give you a little bit of background on stuff. Most of you guys probably know this, so I apologize if it's sort of too familiar, but I'm going to still run it by you. But Western water law, the basics is the underlying tenet of it is the prior appropriation doctrine. First in time, first in right. Basically what that means is if you put water to use, or your grandfather or your great-grandfather or the guy you bought the land from and his great-grandfather put that water to use, moved it off-stream for irrigation from a particular point of diversion to a particular chunk of land for a particular purpose, i.e. to grow a crop, the first time that was used was basically your priority. So we have this priority system. First guys that used it are the first guys that get it every year. So if you've got, say, a priority date of 1875, which actually happened in this state, you get your water before the guy who started putting it to use in 1890, let alone the person who started to put it to use in 1970. So we have this appropriation system. It doesn't seem fair because it has not adjusted to the fact that we now have water demands that are a lot different than they were back in the 19th century. Fish and wildlife are a lot more important, water quality is a lot more important, recreation is a lot more important, but we still manage it for the uses from the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. With that, there's also this principle, it's called use it or lose it. If you don't use your water that you had this right to for all these years, somebody else can claim it and use it. Now, irrigators get really freaked out about that. And they worry about their right will be claimed as abandoned by somebody else and somebody else will get it. And it's a bad deal. And the reason it's a bad deal is because a lot of irrigators and a lot of other water users have a tendency to overuse water just to maintain their water right because they're afraid they're going to lose it. Even though in reality, very rarely does a water court or district court say a right is abandoned. And the problem, there's an irony to that. People are overwatering a lot of places, especially irrigators, and they're turning their croplands where they had mixed grass or they had alfalfa, they're turning it into sedge meadows, creating some seasonal wetlands, which is kind of beneficial, but nonetheless overusing water. But that is one of the bad things about the way prior appropriation works. And of course, your water right or your claim has to be for beneficial use. Traditionally, that's been for irrigation, mining use, industrial, municipal power use, and hydroelectric, which is the only in-stream flow water right we've recognized in the state for a long time. At least in-stream flows up to the dam, not necessarily below the dam. So it just seems like a system that's kind of rigged against people who want to keep water in stream for fish, wildlife, and recreation. Now, I noticed a few months ago there was an outfitter in Dillon going, we got to change this. I'm going to try and put together a bunch of people and have a campaign for a ballot initiative where we're going to demand 20% of the water every year in the summer be left in stream for fish and wildlife. And this is not the first time it's been proposed. Sounds like a pretty good idea, but there is a problem with that. The Montana Constitution sort of leads it on that you should be able to do that because the Constitution says we have an inalienable right to a clean and healthful environment, which implicates we should be able to have fish in rivers because that's part of a clean and healthful environment. The Constitution also says that we collectively own the water in this state. However, it's subject to appropriation. Let me run through a couple of and it's in the handout I gave you guys, which is the outline I'm using for this talk. Really important things in the Montana Constitution. If you're not familiar with it, read it. Read it frequently. It also says a state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. State, sure, GN40, sure, DNRC, sure, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, etc. But also each person. We all have an obligation to maintain a clean and healthful environment in the state. And if you're an activist with TU or an activist with Wildlife Federation, you're doing your part. The governor, Austin Knudsen, Rosendale, not so much. It also says that all surface, this is important, all surface, underground, flooded atmospheric waters within the boundaries of the state are the property of the state for the use of its people. And then it went a little too far. And subject to appropriation for beneficial uses as provided by law. That's kind of the stickler. That's where the Constitution, the clean and healthful environment, has some tension with keeping the fact that we all own water and keep it in stream for fish and wildlife. By the way, that Article 9, Section 3 about us owning the water was basically how we got stream access in the state. That's huge, huge, huge. Now it says, for the use of the people and subject to appropriation and beneficial use as provided by law. That meant that the legislature had to create a law, and they did with the 1973 Montana Water Use Act, which basically established how the prior appropriation system works, who's going to get water first, who's going to get it second, what beneficial uses are. But believe it or not, it's kind of a progressive water law. There's some stuff in there that actually helps us when we want to keep water in stream. And it's better than what we've got in any other Western state that I'm familiar with. The legal recognition of in-stream, and I'm going to get into that stuff, the legal recognition of in-stream flows for fish, wildlife, and recreation as a beneficial use is somewhat of a recent and more limited thing. In-stream flows still bats last. Irrigation's up there, hydro's up there, mining's up there. In-stream flow protection is, bat ninth, actually, not just, so. But that doesn't mean we don't have some options. And I think we have more options than, and my pal, Pat Byron, who knows more about this stuff than me, probably will correct me if I make a mistake here. But there are a lot of things that we could still do without, say, a ballot initiative that overturns Western water law in the state of Montana, which, by the way, back in the late 80s, early 90s, Stan Bradshaw, some of you guys know, he was working for State Trout Unlimited before I was, and I was working for the Clark Fork Coalition. We sat down and go, why don't we file a public trust lawsuit in this state? It says we gotta leave water in stream for fish and wildlife. And we started looking at the Constitution and we go, I don't know, that's gonna be awful tough. It says that, you know, we have to, the appropriation system, we have to sort of accommodate it. And then the other thing we thought about was, even if we did, even if we were successful, it would be like dropping the atom bomb on the state. Think about that. If every person who's currently using water in the state as a water right, diverts water for hay, for mining operation, for cities, if all those guys all of a sudden had to say put 20% of that water back in the stream, the state would blow up. And you talk about UPOM going crazy on something, those guys would, because water rights are recognized as a property right. Courts have established that. People sell them, buy them, trade them, lease them, they borrow on them. A lot of, for example, ranchers do. The value of ranches in the state is often inflated by the value of the water right they might have. So it'd be a real problem. And at that time, this organization, Wildlife Federation, was actually thinking about something like that too. We were talking to them. And back when Rich Day was the director, and there was a little campaign, it was short-lived, and some of you old timers may remember this, but it was, the river runs through in 92. And I go, well, Rich, what are you guys going to do? Well, we're thinking about going to court. And I go, you might want to think about this one a little bit. The word got out about that in the ag community, and which was already pissed about some other things Montana Wildlife Federation was doing it. And all of a sudden we started seeing those signs in the state. Remember them, you guys? You know, private land, like some guy's ranch. Don't ask if you're with the Montana Wildlife Federation. They were ripe. They were ripe to come after people if we had done a public trust lawsuit for water. And I was thinking, geez, 60% of the state's private land, we'd never have BMAs. We'd have very little access on private land. Hunters would be coming after TU. Hunters would be coming after Montana Wildlife Federation if we did that. So Stan and I thought about some other approaches. How can we stretch out the prior appropriation doctrine, look at our water use law in the state, how can we use those things to benefit instream flows, fish, aquatic systems, recreation. So some of the things on the second page of that handout I gave you, and I just started a list, I should run through. A lot of people aren't familiar with this stuff. First thing we had to do is stem the bleeding. No more new surface water rights should be handed out in the state. And so we were able to accomplish both administratively and through the legislature basin closures. So the upper Clark Fork River, including the Blackfoot, everything above Missoula, you can, since, when did we do that? 1995, I think. You cannot get a new surface water right. Okay? Jim Posowitz, God bless him, back in the 70s was able to get, well, actually, Pos did, let's see here. No, Pos did something else I'm going to get to on this thing. The other closures we got on the Bitterroot, no more surface water rights on the Bitterroot, no more surface water rights issued on the Missouri River. We got that in 1995, Pat, was it mid-90s? Yeah, okay. So you can't get a new water right. You can't stick a straw in a creek here anymore, in those watersheds anymore. That's most of the state, most of the water. Of course, then the issue becomes groundwater. So all the developers and everybody started going to groundwater. I'm not really going to talk about groundwater unless you want me to at the end, but there are loopholes in groundwater law that has allowed developers, irrigators, etc. in the past to stick a straw in alluvial groundwater right next to the stream and essentially take the water directly out of the stream. And there was a bill, fortunately killed this legislature, that expanded that loophole. And that was going to be the future battle. So we got to keep an eye on groundwater, because most of the groundwater in the state is connected to surface flows. So basin closures, huge, stem the bleeding. This one's really, really important. In fact, it's something I've still been working on, and that is Fish, Wildlife Park says, over 350 stream reaches with in-stream flow rights. And it's basically from a couple of different things. Number one, the so-called Murphy rights, which were created legislatively in 1970 for 12 blue ribbon streams in the state. Rock Creek, Rock Creek, the Madison, the Main Flathead and its forks, Big Spring Creek, the Gallatin, the East Gallatin, the Blackfoot, and the Missouri, the reach of the Missouri from Tostin down to Ulm. So those all have water rights. The only problem is the priority date in that prior appropriation system is 1970. So they're not the best rights in the world. All these other guys have older rights, and generally people take water off stream, get their water first before that in-stream flow right is satisfied. There are a couple places where it makes a difference. The Blackfoot, we've got junior rights up there that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is senior to. And there's some tributaries of, and the Yellowstone was also in there, of the Yellowstone and tributaries in the Missouri system with our junior water rights to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So the way you defend your water right and in-stream flow right is you make a call on those juniors and say, we're not getting enough to meet our right, X amount of CFS at this point, you guys got to shut down. So Fish, Wildlife, Parks has that ability to do it in some places around the state. Besides Murphy rights, they also have something called water reservations, which was something that was created from that Water Use Act that we had in 1973. And reservations are really, really important. And that's what possibly the state. I don't know if you guys remember in the 70s when the coal companies in this state wanted to grind up a bunch of coal, create a slurry, pump water out of the Yellowstone River and ship it somewhere out of state. And Haas remarkably did just a hell of a job putting together a national campaign to save the Yellowstone River. And the way we did it was we got these reservations, which are an type of in-stream flow right for the Yellowstone, for most of the Yellowstone River upstream of, Pat, do you know how far down they go? Digging on the Powder? Pardon me?
Go all the way.
They do go all the way to the border, okay. And it's like a few hundred tributaries plus the main stem. Unfortunately, it's not super senior, right, but it's important. The other thing that's really good about those reservations is downstream states couldn't claim the water because when you have a reservation that says you're using it or you're gonna use it, in our water rights system, the other states are gonna have to respect that. So we didn't have this mess like we have in Colorado, where Wyoming and Colorado, the upper basin states, have to let water leave so that California and Arizona can get it. It was brilliantly prescient of Paz and some other folks to do that. And that's because these reservations were something that was written into that 1973 Water Use Act. So Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has a whole bunch of those rights. They've got a few recreational rights. A lot of people don't know that. In-stream flows for recreation. The Bitterroot, the Lower Beaverhead, and I think the Tobacco. Yeah, 3. And they've never been defended. They're very junior, but they've never been defended. This has been an issue recently. Some of you guys may remember this. Summer before last, the governor goes, Fish, Wildlife, Parks, I don't want you to defend, make a call on your in-stream flow rights on the Shields and on the Smith Rivers, because I think we need to really reevaluate what we're doing with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks having in-stream flow rights. And he goes, I want the department to come up with some new protocol that lets other water users know what you got, what you're going to do. Well, it was all about other water users, but it wasn't about improving the system for fish. And so Chris Clancy, retired fishery biologist, some of you guys know, and I put together an alliance. We got 22 of our colleague, retired fishery professionals from Fish, Wildlife, Parks to write a letter to the governor and say, this is baloney. You got all these things wrong. We ought to be actually trying to figure out a way to improve the defense of in-stream flows rather than making the department have to go out and defend it all the time. Anyway, the last year, Chris and I have been trying to work with staff to make sure that that protocol that they have to write isn't going to hinder the department. And actually, the protocol that they've come up with isn't too bad. And we said, well, you guys have opened the door. Let's make it better. So we made a bunch of suggestions to the staff who are petrified petrified that they're gonna have to rewrite some of this protocol, because a couple people are bugging them about it. But the point is, we wanna improve Fish, Wildlife Parks' ability to defend 350 potential or actual in-stream flow water rights that they have in the state. Last year, they did make a call and defended the right on the Shields. They did on the Smith, and they did on 5 other streams in the state. So I think the governor's office sort of forgot about the issue, hopefully. Some other tools. In 1989, 1991 to 95, we were able to go to the legislature. TU, the Health of Clarkville Coalition early, was to get Fish, Wildlife, and Parks be able to lease consumptive water right for in-stream flows. And then in 95, TU, with the help of Wildlife Federation, and Jim Richards, you guys remember Jim, wonderful guy. Jim was super helpful. We negotiated with the ag groups in the state to allow private interests to lease an in-stream flow water right, leave it in stream for fish. Importantly, we also wrote in that bill, you don't even have to lease it. If you could talk to a rancher and he wants to leave this water in stream, he doesn't have to have a third party involved. He can just do it. You just got to run it through this process through DNRC to make sure it isn't going to harm other legitimate water right holders on that stream. So we've got a whole bunch of streams in the state now. They're not the main stems, but they're important spawning, rearing, wintering, foraging habitat, tributaries that are actually producing fish. And I can tell you a few that we were able to get some leases on that have produced fish. Hell's Canyon Creek is producing the rainbows that we're catching on the Jefferson that we weren't catching 20 years ago. There's a whole bunch of more cutthroats and bull trout in the Blackfoot River because of some leases we were able to do up there. And there's a few places in the Bitterroot that have produced more rainbows in the river than we've had for quite a while. So it is working. It's kind of a market approach. Nonetheless, it's working. Another really important thing people don't know about, and you Forest Service old timers may know this, but we have federal water reservations in the state. And basically, when national forests were set up, BLM lands were established, national parks and wildlife refuges were established, they all had water rights, reserved water rights that went with the reservation that Congress made. So basically, every national forest in Montana had a water right when it was established, but it had never been enumerated. Purpose, where the water was, how much it was going to be, what the priority date was going to be. The other thing that came out of the Water Use Act was, this was really brilliant actually, the legislature said, we're not going to argue with the feds as a state on who's got water, what do the feds have for water rights, what we don't have for water. We're going to set up a compact commission to negotiate these reserved water rights. And the result has been that all these federal reservations in the state, wildlife refuges, BLM, parks, and especially national forests, have negotiated with the state of Montana for their in-stream flow water rights, to enumerate them, to stay where they are, to stay what the purpose is. The Forest Service has done a killer job. I worked with them on this. They've done a really good job. We've got a few hundred streams in the state that have in-stream flow rights enumerated for the Forest Service, and they're like priority streams. They have a very recent priority date. The thing is, they're going to be the oldest and most important in the future when people come to national forest headwaters to develop that water, because that's where they're going to be going. It's really, really pretty forward-thinking approach, and I think the Forest Service in Montana did a really, really good job. So we now have in-stream flow water rights on these tributaries, the Blackfoot, the Jeff, the Missouri, the Big Hole, the Bitterroot. And so if some guy in the future wants to have a little hydro deal or wants to pump water downstream for a Twinkie factory or something like that, Forest Service is going to have a senior water right. And they can say, sorry, you have to satisfy our right now. So we've essentially stopped the potential for water development on tributaries of national forests in the state, almost. The other one is the tribal reservations. With the treaties that go with 7 reservations in the state and the various tribes that are involved, Basically, based on Supreme Court legal precedent, virtually all the tribes in the state, besides the rights they have to hunt and fish on reservations, also have the right to hunt and fish in all the usual and accustomed places outside reservations. Well, you can't fish outside a reservation if there's no water. And so basically, that has been the leverage for tribes in the state to negotiate with the state of Montana through the Compact Commission to enumerate their rights and their priority dates and their amount of water for what purpose. The one that really sticks out, of course, is Dale's very familiar with this, and Jim, there's a few other people, is the Salish and Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribe Compact, which is really a really good deal. It's actually a good deal for all water users in the state, but it's also a really good deal for fish. Because we're going to have some in-stream flow protections both on the reservation and a few new ones off the reservation. Like the Upper Clark Fork should have more water in it than it's traditionally had because of the shared water right as a result of the compact that the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribe are going to have with Fish Wildlife Parks at Milltown. There's going to have to be more water by 2025. It has to get to Milltown than has in the past. So it's pretty important. The other thing that voluntary drought plans around the state, negotiated with generally inside some of these watershed groups that we have in the state. We've got 3 really important ones, kind of work. They're not great. They're better than nothing. They've helped fish. Big Hole, Jefferson, Big Blackfoot, where we have voluntary drought plans where water users have agreed based on certain thresholds, flow thresholds, that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has negotiated with them, and Trout Unlimited and others, that they will voluntarily leave water in stream when you hit some of these critical thresholds at a particular point on the river. And it's actually been super beneficial in the Blackfoot. It really works in the Blackfoot. It has been very helpful in the Big Hole. There are irrigators that aren't taking as much water as they have in the past. One thing that helps is we've invested in infrastructure down there so they have more efficient use of their water. You know, they got better head gates so they can turn them down and they don't leak, and we can leave the water in stream. But nonetheless, it's been very beneficial. The only problem is when we have really bad years, there's always 1 or 2 people in these watersheds that says, oh, look at all this water coming downstream. Yeah, I know some people say it's for the fish, but I'm going to take it. The people who aren't part of the agreements. But nonetheless, they're pretty important. People sitting around, fishermen, conservationists, sitting there with irrigators, DNRC, Fish, Wildlife, Parks, trying to hash out basically, you know, a neighborly approach to leaving water in stream, to share it and to share the pain. And then also another approach we have is that there's better use of the storage facilities we have in the state for maintaining in-stream flows. We've done it with the most famous cases, the Painted Rocks Reservoir in the Bitterroot, saves the Bitterroot. You know, if you've been around for a while, I used to be able to walk across the Bitterroot at Bell Crossing, which is down near Stevensville. Walk across that, and literally, I'm not making this up, in August, pretty much keep your feet dry. Now we have water, even in the worst years. Sometimes it's not a lot, but it's enough to cover riffles. It's good survival flows for fish, all the way down to Bell Crossing and below, actually, because Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has been able to contract for 15,000 acre-feet of water at Painted Rocks Reservoir that formerly may have gone to irrigators, but now the department is paying DNRC, and the water is dedicated to fish. This is how that worked. This was a great one. There's always been the Ravalli County Fish and Game Association back in the 50s. Way back in the 50s, they were able to get DNRC, which runs that dam, to dedicate 5,000 acre-feet for in-stream flows. Well, it didn't get very far downstream. As soon as it hit the big ditch down there below Garbage, gone. But back in early 90s, there was an opportunity to cut a deal for Painted Rocks. The dam had to be fixed. There were some problems with it. DNRC goes, we don't have any money. You know, they never have money for stuff. TU knew how to get some money and was get it from a federal program that the BPA has, and said, well, look, we'll dig up the money to fix the dam if you guys give Fish, Wildlife, Parks another 10,000 acre-feet in perpetuity. We had to go to the legislature to get that, but that's what we've got. It's really a wonderful model. We've got that water. We've looked at doing it for the Ruby Dam, to get that water down the Ruby, into the Jefferson, and then down into the Missouri. And we did have a proposal about a dozen years ago. We took to the legislature, we had to fix Ruby Dam and go, we can help come up with a couple $1 million more. Could you guys raise the dam, increase the storage, that extra storage we could release later in the season for fish downstream? We had it all set, but the Schweitzer administration kind of screwed us on the deal. We talked to some landowners down there, and it was just, and they fixed the dam, but we didn't get the extra storage. But that option is still out there. And there's some other places around the state we've looked at, possibly a couple of the state facilities in the Upper Smith. We might be able to, at some point, figure out a way to get contracted water into the river for fish. So the other way is every time one of these federal, private hydro dams in the state has to get relicensed by the feds, by Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, there's always an opportunity there to improve the operations at the dam so that we can get water downstream on a tailwater that's a lot more fish friendly than has been in the past. I mean, we originally did that on Holter. Remember Missouri 25 years ago, 30 years ago, was terrible fishery below the dam because they were bouncing the flows and all that. When they got relicensed, they had to sort of maintain sort of some base flows, and that's why we've got this incredible tailwater fishery on Missouri. Finally, the last tool that we have is there's a lot of money out there for this stuff. Figuring out how to get it's another thing. We've got state funding sources like a future fishery improvement program, which is funded, which has been used for instream flow leases, which you guys as license holders in the state pay for. We've got federal money. We got $250 million out of the infrastructure bill. That some of that can go to really large water stream flow improvement projects in Montana. And I'm working with a group on the Sun right now to see if we can't figure out a way to deal with some of the flow issues we have on the Sun by maybe investing some of this money in making more efficient irrigation infrastructure over there so that Muddy Creek, famous Muddy Creek outside Great Falls, isn't ripping down there every year. And instead, it's just a trickle because the water is left upstream in the big irrigation diversions, went to all the crops up on the Fairfield bench. The crops used it, and it wasn't all these return flows that went down Muddy Creek. I look at that as just a hell of an opportunity. The water's going down Muddy Creek, and then it's just washing all the sediment down to the reservoirs in the Missouri, and that water is just getting impounded and used for hydro. When a lot of that water could be left in the river way upstream instead of diverting it. We had more efficient irrigation infrastructure, but the irrigators use that water up on the Fairfield bench down at Sims if they'd invest in that stuff. So we're going to maybe try and figure out how to get some of that infrastructure money into that. That's it. Lots of stuff. It's not hopeless. You know, there are things to do. What I just wanted to close with was that thing in the Constitution about we all have an obligation to providing a clean, healthy environment for the state. More people need to understand that and get involved in some of these programs that I've just sort of outlined. The watershed group issues, working with landowners, I mean, there's actually a lot of irrigators out there who do actually want to work with you on this stuff. If you can make them whole, as long as you don't add a lot of pain. And a lot of it's a matter of water use efficiency. I look at water use in the state, especially the ag community, but also with the cities. And there's a lot of water that's wiggle room water that we could leave in streams, and there wouldn't be any additional pain to those existing water users. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. A lot of stuff recognized on a Saturday morning, opening up with water rights and stuff like that. You guys are going, I didn't have enough coffee. But questions? Glenn?
Bruce, you mentioned that water right owner can choose to leave water in stream, 20%, I think you said. Is that considered beneficial use? And if so, what's the foundation for this?
Oh, is water left in stream considered beneficial use? It is now, yes. It's not as clear cut as, it doesn't say that in our Water Use Act. Actually, technically, there always used to be in law in the state, not always, but for a long time, water for fish and wildlife was considered beneficial use, but it was diverted water. It was, until recently, until we changed the law and got the instream flow leasing and some other things, water left in stream was not considered a beneficial use, but it is now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm sure there's a lot of legal nuance in there that.
There is. The guy right next to it probably can fill you in.
I get him across it.
And I do want to say, I've been working on this stuff a long, long time. I'm not an attorney, but to you and other conservations in the state would not have been able to make some of the progress. I mean, we have a better instream flow situation here than I think every other western state, and it wouldn't have happened without the three best water attorneys in the state who happen to work for TU. Pat Byworth, Laura Zever, who many of you don't know, but you should. Laura started a project in the state, Montana Water Project, for instream flow protection, and Stan Bradshaw, who's an old timer here in Helena. Without those guys, I mean, they're the best, and I can't say enough about them. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not a fisheries person, so I just put that out as the rest of this question. So when you consider about most efficient practices relative to irrigation, at this point in time, what are those for you? And to irrigators, what would those be?
It would be more efficient head gates. We've all seen these quote diversions that are a bunch of boards and plastic, and a couple of logs or something like that. The more efficient head gates, that's a good investment because they can turn it down when they need to turn it down, or turn it up when they need to turn it up. Riparian improvements, keeping the cows out of riparian is huge. Fencing this stuff, keep them out. Riparian vegetation comes up, the stream gets stabilized. Groundwater, we get increased groundwater storage, which is water that is released later in the season. So there's also that. Switching from flood irrigation to sprinkler, or sprinkler to flood, depending on the situation. There's water to be conserved there. There's lining canals. There's quite a few things that can be done out there.
So, I don't really want to get into this too much right now. So when you go to more efficient systems, there's a consequence to that people typically pick up that excess water that they now have and do other things with it, right?
Excellent point.
Love that outcome.
Basically, investments, those are public investments, and it was an investment that Trout Unlimited negotiates or Wildlife Federation negotiates. The deal is the conserved water goes to the fish. And so, there's complicated legal mechanisms to establish that, but yeah.
I just reflect when I was driving over maybe Miles City or that neck of the woods along the freeway. We're seeing lots of irrigation go up on the side hills, like sagebrush side hills that never saw water since the Pleistocene. And just that extra water going up to change out the sagebrush, legs, all that kind of stuff, and move it into irrigated cropland, principally the scourge of all scourge in my mind, alfalfa.
That's a problem. That is a problem. Yeah, water spreading and expanded use, especially for really water-thirsty crops. And there's an issue right now with Sydney Sugars in Sydney is shut down. So Lower Yellowstone Irrigation District, which has about 60,000 acres of irrigated cropland. Those guys, they're going to have a market for their sugar beets. So let's watch what they convert to. It'll probably be something thirstier, corn, definitely alfalfa. So yeah, it's an issue.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, you bet, Chris.
Thanks, Bruce. That was great.
Thanks.
I learned a lot about this, even at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So, good job. Melissa. You have a flash drive. Yeah.
While they're setting that up, a couple things that people don't realize, a lot of times in August, while streams are drying up, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks gets a lot of calls. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, unless they have an instream right, can do very little about it. The other is that DNRC is just basically a conduit for water rights. And they will keep giving water rights out other than closed basin until not only the stream goes dry, but in many cases, they give out rights for 2 or 3 times the flow that's in the stream. And that creates a huge spike. And if you are a senior water right holder and you think somebody junior's taking water out, DNRC won't fight for you. You have to go to district court and fight them, and you have to hire a ditch rider to make sure your water gets through. So it's a real weird system. I give a lot to the watershed groups that are trying to keep water in the streams. That sitting around a table over coffee is a good way to settle things. So, thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker is Alyssa Schrodt. She holds an MS in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana with a focus on bear conservation. She has almost 10 years of experience in human-bear conflict mitigation, and since 2019, she has been managing the Beaver Conflict Resolution Project based in Missoula to help landowners coexist with beavers. Alyssa.
Good morning, thanks for having me. So yeah, like Chris just said, I run the Beaver Conflict Resolution Project out of Missoula, mostly serving FWP Region 2, but I wanted to talk today and go through kind of the state management and then the Beaver Working Group, which is statewide, and kind of give an overview of what they do, and then dive into the conflict project and how we can manage beavers non-lethally. And so first, just diving into the state management aspect of it. And I will say that at the end, if you guys have state management questions for FWP, I can point you to the person to ask those to, because I would not be the correct one. So of course, they're managed by FWP, and they kind of fill 3 different roles. So they're a fur bearer, there's trapping seasons on them, you can harvest them for furs. They're also nuisances, so the game wardens get a lot of calls of, I have a beaver cutting down trees or damming and flooding my property, what do I do? And then they can also be really great restoration stewards. Their habitat and their wetlands create just a myriad of benefits for the ecosystems. And so FWP also manages beavers with the restoration aspect in mind. And so as a fur bearer, there are seasonal restrictions, but there's no bag limits or mandatory reportings. And there are certain areas that are closed to beaver harvest, and that can be for protection of otters if they're trying to prevent beaver overharvest, or if there's restoration efforts that have been done that they need beavers to stay there to kind of maintain what's been done and to help vegetation regenerate, or that floodplain to start being reconnected because they're retaining sediment, whatever might be the case. And so most of the state is open to beaver trapping during set seasons by FWP. And so the nuisance side of things, that beavers do great things, yes, but depending on where they're trying to do those great things, they might not be so great. And so like this photo is actually on Lolo Pass up and over Highway 12 outside of Missoula, and that's somebody's yard that they're just putting their dam through. So the beaver damage permits are issued either by FWP game wardens or biologists. Not all landowners want beavers, and so if there's not an immediate conflict that they're saying, hey, we need a damage permit to keep them from flooding our driveway or whatever the issue might be, then the game warden might say, well, you're going to need to wait for trapping season and just have a trapper come in and remove them at that time. Not all places are appropriate for beavers. If they're in irrigation ditches, it's really hard to do any of the non-lethal mitigation that I'll get into later. But the habitat benefits that they're going to set up in that area are going to be minimal too. If they're in the middle of a hayfield trying to gnaw on the little bit of willows that are on the sides of the irrigation ditch, the habitat benefits are going to be very minimal. And so that's not a very appropriate place for a beaver to stay. And then the non-lethal methods don't work at every site. They are very site specific. Sometimes the landowner goals don't match up with what the beavers are going to need to survive and stay in place and be happy. And so then trapping is going to be their option to deal with that conflict. And oh, I think the formatting messed up. So that top column should say that relocation isn't easy. So you need a full environmental assessment of wherever you're going to be moving the beavers to. And so if you have a beaver flooding a driveway, that months-long process of the EA is not going to be the correct option for them. And then the final approval of relocating beavers goes to the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So it's very rare that beavers actually get moved around in Montana. States like Washington and Oregon and Colorado can move them around quite easily just because of the way their state policies work. And so once you have trapped the beavers, then you're going to have to quarantine and make sure that you're not going to spread diseases like tularemia from one watershed to another. And so there needs to be a facility for quarantine and disease control. And then there's the question of liability. Once you move the beavers to the new habitat, if they move upstream or downstream and they cause damage for another landowner, who is liable for that then? And as restoration stewards, they offer really great habitat benefits for about 80% of Montana species depend on beaver-created wetlands at some point during their life cycle. And so that can also mean that when beaver dams blow out and you have the beaver meadows then start taking over because the streams start shrinking down and you have that really fertile soil. And so the sedges and the grasses start growing back. The vegetation and the willows start regenerating and suckering. Then you have like ungulates that can use that area as well once beavers move out. But the ponds themselves, amphibians, ungulates like moose, of course, rely on it, waterfowl, lots of fish species, your mustelids like your mink and otter, and then a bunch of other species also just love beaver wetlands because they create such great habitat. And so that's why FWP can manage them as restoration stewards, because there might be a species of concern that depend on beaver-created ponds for survival or for rearing, like West Slope cutthroat trout might have spawning grounds in beaver ponds. And healthy watersheds, they help cycle nutrients, they retain sediment. So once the sediment, suspended sediment hits those beaver ponds and starts slowing down, it sinks. And so it creates this kind of buildup over the years, and that can help incised streams reconnect their floodplains and help just with general restoration. And that if you have a bunch of cattle or something happen to the stream, mining, and so it can help reconnect those floodplains as well. And then non-lethal coexistence, I work really closely with Tori Ritter out of, he's a non-game biologist for Region 2 FWP, and he and I work very closely together identifying conflicts, and he's been a very good proponent of the conflict project within FWP, because the conflict project uses non-lethal methods to keep beavers in place so that we can have those good habitat benefits and the healthy watersheds, but without the damage that beavers are causing for landowners. And then that in itself creates these tolerance corridors so that if beavers are trying to move from one area of public lands where they have lots of space to spread out and create their wetlands, but then they keep getting trapped out at this one culvert every year as they try and disperse and move to another area that would be suitable habitat, can we fix that culvert issue so that then we can have these corridors back and forth so that they can move around on the landscapes? There's no current statewide population estimates available, but FWP will begin to conduct an aerial dam census, and so that will give them an idea of how many colonies and a general idea of how many beavers are in the state. There are a few areas that do track population numbers, but it's very, there's just a handful there down at the bottom. And then Spotted Dog, WMA, they're tracking beaver populations for restoration efforts right now. And so moving on to the beaver working group, this is statewide, anybody can join. I have a contact at the end of the presentation. If anybody wants to be part of the newsletter or the meetings, feel free. We always welcome new people to come in and join. And so this group was formed back, I want to say, Amy Chadwick formed it in maybe 2012 or 2014, somewhere around in there. But it has about a monthly or bi-monthly newsletter that shares what beaver activities are going on, what groups are doing what for beaver restoration around the state. There's webinars that people can join and learn about the research and projects going on. There's workshops and field trips, and so the field trips are kind of go hand in hand with the workshops, but it's just sharing strategies, what's going on, come get in a beaver pond with me and do a coexistence project, those sorts of things. And we just had our annual meeting a couple weeks ago, and with that, we have 4 different groups and 4 different areas that are being worked on, and we kind of refined these goals. I'm the co-chair for Goal 3, which is the education and outreach, but Goal 1 is to scale up and expand beyond isolated beaver habitat projects and integrate beaver into the design and approach of stream and wetland restoration. Goal 2 is to restore riverscapes and beavers on public lands to sustain ecological processes, support biodiversity, and build resilience to drought, wildfires, and flooding. Goal 3 is to provide coordinated education and outreach on the benefits of beaver-related restoration, and that's where coexistence and the conflict project falls into as well. And then Goal 4 is streamline legal and policy processes for beaver habitat restoration and relocation of beavers to suitable prioritized habitat. And so that's kind of how can we go beyond, or how can we streamline the environmental assessment process so that if people do want to relocate a beaver, and then if somebody else wants a beaver to come and build habitat on their property, how can we get beaver from point A to point B without a month-long process? And these are some of our members. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but it goes from tribes to NGOs, engineering groups, university groups, private citizens, agencies, watershed groups. And so we have a diverse group of people working on these issues statewide. And so moving on to the conflict resolution project. This was an idea that came out of conversations that the National Wildlife Federation, the Defenders of Wildlife, and Clark Court Coalition had with landowners and agencies based on, well, yeah, beavers are great, but they can be nuisances. And so how do we get past that barrier of beavers are flooding my property, I want them here, but I can't have them flooding my driveway or cutting down the trees that are right next to the cattle pens, and the trees are crushing the fences. Issues like that kept popping up. And so people recognized the importance of beavers, but they didn't know how to live with them. And so that's when these partners came up with the idea to make my position and create this program. And so number 1 is to build more tolerance and understanding for beavers on the landscape. And that's by reducing beaver conflicts via non-lethal methods and helping landowners live with beavers if they want beavers on their property. And then also to train partners to implement these non-lethal methods. I try and get other watershed groups out with me, or I go and help watershed groups like Blackfoot Challenge address their own landowner beaver conflicts. And so just working with different partners around Region 2 to make sure that people are familiar with this program and that they may be one day comfortable enough to install these devices by themselves. We have 3 main conflicts that I get calls for, and that's tree cutting, culvert plugging, and then freestanding dam flooding. And so tree cutting, you can wrap the trees. Culvert plugging, exclusion fences, and freestanding dams are pond levelers. And this isn't an animal welfare project by any means. We're not trying to save individual beavers. This is like watershed and landscape scale project, but because trapping will always be a necessary management option. These devices don't work in every case, and like I said before, that sometimes landowners can't have a big giant pond in one area, and that's what the beavers are trying to do, and a device isn't going to work to keep the beavers happy because they're going to need more water than what the landowner can tolerate, and so trapping is going to have to be their management option. With tree cutting, we wrap it with sturdy 2-inch by 4-inch mesh and keep it out away from the trees so that you don't girdle the trees and you're the one killing the trees instead of the beavers. And I really don't recommend chicken wire. I've seen beavers just gnaw straight through that. They have literally iron teeth. That's why their teeth are orange. That's reinforced with iron pretty much. And so it's just a good idea to make sure that you're giving the tree enough space to grow. And this type of fencing, it's utility wire, welded wire. It has a bunch of different names, but it's sturdy enough for it to stand up on its own. Freestanding dam flooding. This is called a pond leveler. And so this pipe here, if you notch the dam, can you guys still hear me? I'm away from your mic, okay. If you notch the dam, you can feed the pipe through and then cover it back over, and the beavers will come and patch that as well. But whatever height you set that pipe through the dam is what the water is going to drain to. So you're pretty much creating a leak through the dam with a plastic culvert, and we use 12-inch or 15-inch. And then up here at the top, you're going to want to cage that intake because beavers are drawn to any sort of pool or flowing water, the sound of running water too. That's what keys them into dams certain areas. And so keep them out away from that pool of water as the water enters the pipe, and they'll leave that intake alone. But then they're used to water flowing on the downstream side of the pipe. So the outlet side is great. They leave that side alone, but you're creating a leak through their dam, and you can generally sneak away about a vertical foot of water before they start to notice. And that level can kind of be tweaked depending on if they have a lodge on their pond or not. If they have a lodge, you're going to want to leave them at least 3 feet of water so that they'll have enough space under the ice to reach their caches in the winter. And so again, that goes with this, that device might not work in every situation because maybe the landowner can't have a 3 feet or a 3 foot deep pond in that area. This is one that we did last fall, right after installation. So the beavers would have come back and built and repaired that dam because we are very poor beavers. As you can see, we just stacked some sticks on top so that they would get the idea. But again, we just notched the dam, put the pipe through, caged the intake, and put it out into deeper water. And this area, the conflict here was on this side of the picture. There was a big cattle pasture, and they had lost like several acres to the pond, and it was just a big muddy mess for the cows. With culvert plugging, culverts are a hole in an otherwise perfectly good dam to a beaver because you have that nice road bed, and then somebody was rude and came in and put in a culvert instead of just making that whole thing a dam for them. And so with very little effort, they can come and plug up that culvert inlet and back up water. And as the previous picture, that was a 5-foot culvert that they had plugged to the top. So they are very efficient in their culvert plugging ways. But again, you just want to keep them out away from that pool of water into the culvert inlet. And so we use cattle panels, and every fence is designed differently depending on the stream, the size of the culvert, what's going on vegetation-wise on the stream banks. And every culvert fence is going to have a floor so that the beavers don't tunnel under and get into the culvert. So it's not pictured here, but all culvert fences have floors. So this is one in Foster Creek outside of Anaconda that we did a couple years ago. And it's been working great ever since. And so sometimes you can combine the two, a pond leveler and a culvert fence, if there's not going to be enough room for a full-size culvert fence, because the culvert fences have to be built far enough out away and upstream so that the beavers don't key into that flow of water. And so they're generally larger, 12 by 12 by 12 if you have that space. Sometimes that one on Foster Creek This one was about 4 feet by, I think we ran it upstream probably 12 or 14 feet. And so if there's not space in your stream system for that, you can build a little tiny culvert fence, knowing that they're going to be close enough to that flow and sound of trickling water into the culvert that they're going to come back and dam. But you can put your pipe through it and create a fence and pipe device. And then that pipe here is going to be your water control level. And so again, that's going to create the leak through the dam. Make sure you have water flow. The beavers think they're holding back water. They have a little bit of a pond up here, but that's going to be your control right there. And this is one we have in Lost Creek State Park. We installed this one in 2019 and it's been working like a dream for the park maintenance. They're quite happy with it. So again, this was a tiny little culvert too. It was an 18-inch culvert and that whole pond was about 17 feet wide. And so we knew like right off the bat that we were gonna have to put in a fence and pipe because there's no way we could build a big enough, just a culvert fence to keep the beavers away from all of that. So from 2019 to 2022, it's just been me as the conflict specialist serving FWP Region 2. However, this year is really exciting because we, or the partners have hired a second beaver conflict specialist. And so Nick is going to be starting with Freshwater Partners and he'll be based out of Livingston and he will be serving the Helena area too. So he'll be working in FWP Region 3. And again, just expanding, we'll be able to work with, or Nick will be able to work with new partners and help train them in these non-lethal methods as well. So thank you so much again for having me. And that's Shelby's contact. If you want to be added to the Montana working group or Montana Beaver working group, you can email them and they can add you to the list. So thank you. Are there any questions? Do we have time for questions?
Oh, yes.
Great. Yes.
In regards to the relocation, what's that criteria for an area, that public land, that sort of thing? And then secondly, what's the quarantine time?
I don't know the quarantine time, and I don't think there's a criteria. It would be habitat-based criteria, not necessarily public or private land, because I think like Spotted Dog WMA, I think they're looking at relocating beavers there, and that's public. But then if a private landowner wanted to have beavers relocated to their property, they could as well. They would just have to go through that EA process and all of that. But Tori Ritter would be the one, and maybe I can put this contact up here. Can I edit this really quick and put it up here for you guys? No, I don't think I can. His email, I can tell it to you really quick if you would like. TORREY.RITTER@mt.gov.
Thank you.
Yes, and he actually did his master's on beaver dispersal, and some of his colonies were wiped out by tularemia, so he would know much more about that disease than I do. Any other questions? Yes.
So you're right, beavers love culverts. They're just made to order, and needless to say, unplugging a culvert's real tricky. And those exclusionary devices work really well. Beavers can be incredibly damaging in the wrong places. And I was fisheries manager in Kalispell, and the old steel bridge fishing access right adjacent. On the Flathead River, we had beavers set up shop, and they were starting to clear cut the place. And so we wrapped the critical trees with wires, but there was simply over 400 acres you couldn't wrap everything. And there was a river trail, and I had an Eagle Scout project, and taking out down trees. They took out, they had to cut open 140 trees in a quarter mile. The beavers were really busy, and we eventually had to call in a trapper. And there's plenty of beavers up there, so we had to do lethal control, unfortunately, and that took care of the problem pretty well. So, have you run across the project in Idaho to parachute beavers into the backcountry? That was an interesting one.
It was, and you know, it worked. I think only one of them, or like one of them died, I think, on impact or something. And so it was like to have such a weird idea of we're gonna parachute beavers in, like the survival rate for just the dropping them down was high in my opinion. But yeah, that they also, Dan Tyers, I think with US Forest Service or retired from them, I think he used to backpack beavers in too, in Montana. But yeah, there have been different methods to getting beavers in high places.
You know, and they have great value back there. It's fish habitat, it stabilizes drainages, and it provides water downstream late in the summer. But they were simply eliminated. So Idaho came up with this idea to parachute them in, and it worked amazingly well. So yeah, you have to think out of the box.
There any other questions? Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, they had boxes that would open on this, and they just fly over and pick them.
I did. I gotta look at that, those pictures, that was
It
fascinating.
was pretty fun. So.
Thanks, Alyssa, that was great. Really pretty amazing stuff. Parachuting beavers, that's pretty cool. But they must have little parachutes, but how do the beavers get out of their parachutes? So, maybe like little smoke jumper outfits and stuff. So our next speaker is Pat Byarth. Most of you know Pat. He was a fisheries biologist with Fish, Wildlife and Parks for 17 years, and then he decided to go to law school. And he became an attorney with Trout Unlimited and their director of water policy. Most recently, he was on the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission for almost 5 years. And we really appreciated him in that position, and we really miss him now that he's not there. So, Pat.
Thanks, Chris. I feel a little awkward. I dressed up because my dad told me you show respect for the institution. And I feel like I'm here to preach to the choir because I look around the room and you're like my professors, whether you're a conservationist or they're former commissioners. I learned this stuff from you, and so I hope I do it justice. The charge really today was to try and look out into the future and say, where can we go to protect this wealth of wildlife and these fisheries resources that we actually, as Montanans, had to rebuild, not quite from scratch, but from near extirpation. And so I'd like to talk about maybe the elements of those, of the success that brought us to this day that we need to carry forward into the future and hopefully take it out of the abstract and maybe talk about a few policy decisions that I think we should make as Montanans to perpetuate this wealth of wildlife and fisheries. First, I'd like to start with a hunting story. You know, I've been at it since I was a kid, since before I could carry a gun. And this is the first time in my life this March, about a month ago today, a buddy called me up and said, hey, I got these dudes that work up at Big Sky that bought a bunch of pheasants at a shooting preserve in the valley. And they said, hey, we can't get out there. You want to go out there? So my buddy calls me up, and we've hunted together for years, and a couple other buddies. And we packed up. It was one of the first decent weather days that we've had, both, probably since November, where the sun was shining. It was a gorgeous day. It was in the 30s, so you could walk around with a t-shirt on, and it was beautiful. Took the dogs, got out the favorite shotgun, the whole package. Got out there on the ground. The birds had been released the night before, and had a great day. My dog, I have a little Boykin Spaniel who looks like a lap dog but performs like a champ. And she made a couple beautiful flushes and retrieves, one out across the river. Great day. But the dogs also caught about a half of the birds that were released because they didn't even know how to fly. So here we are, this beautiful day, other than the post holing and needing snow, it was almost a good hunt. But what was the essential ingredient that was missing? Wild birds. And I think that's what Montana possesses in a way that few states still have. Sure, Alaska has abundance of wild country and abundance of wildlife. But our access to our wildlife, our access to our fisheries, our access to engage and have that intimate relationship that you can come by best by hunting or fishing. It was that wild ingredient was missing. And it was the first time and probably the last time, but now I can judge because I've actually done it. But it spoke to me about when Chris asked if I give a presentation, it made me think about what is the essential ingredient of wild in Montana and how have we, you know, the word they use in Europe now is rewilded Montana in a sense. And I kind of boil it down to three things. And again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I learned this from you. But the public trust is the first part. And the second part is our focus shifted to habitat, whether it's clean water, healthy rivers, healthy landscapes, wild country. And the third part is we follow the science. And so I'd like to kind of step through those stepwise to try and illustrate that we have to carry these bulwarks forward. They're not in the past. They served us well sometimes they haven't. But how do we apply those theories into the future? So first, the public trust. Two words, public and trust. Let's start with public. We are the owners of the wildlife, all of us. Montanans, the people own the wildlife, and it's held in trust by the state for our benefit. And that essential ingredient, that it belongs to the people, and the people, if we have access to it, and we can be in a relationship with that wildlife and those wild lands, we're going to be the ones that perpetuate it. And each of you are here because that's what you're doing. You're doing the Lord's work. You're out there not just engaging in the recreational pursuit, but the public, we are also engaged in the perpetuation and conservation of that. So the essential notion of a public trust revolves around us, and it has in Montana, because if you think back to around even before statehood, when Granville Stewart says, you know, in the Deer Lodge Valley, we largely extirpated our large game populations before statehood. But who started turning the tide was Granville Stewart started putting together a local rod and gun club. And local rod and gun clubs, many of which you're affiliated with, were the ones that started doing the work, actually transplanting, doing the actions, taking the actions, moving elk from the refuges in Yellowstone Park or up on the front, and starting spreading them back across the landscape. So really it was a grassroots effort. We, as Montanans, taxed ourselves, right? We pay for a tag, but we also pay a tax on our equipment that started in 1937, and then again in 1955, the PRMEJ. We funded that. So without that essential public element, our abundance of fish and wildlife is going to go away. The second half of that is the word trust, the public trust. And trust has two meanings, a dictionary meaning, where you're in a relationship that's based on, trusting relationship based on familiarity and a willingness to trust another person to do what's right. But the legal meaning of that is trust is a legal entity that holds property in trust and for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And so that notion of public trust wraps around two ways, right? First, we have to trust that our trustees, the people who manage fish and wildlife, are going to do the right thing. And that trust gets called into question at times. And who has to rally to make our trustees do the job and do it well? Well, that's the public. It all revolves back to us, the owners, the anglers, the hunters, the conservationists, to make sure that our agency's doing the right thing. Imagine my surprise. I'm a lawyer now. I still consider myself a biologist with a law degree. But I read a legal brief, where the department was being sued, and I, as a commissioner, I've been named, but now I'm not. I read the brief, and I read the department attorneys arguing that the public trust has never been applied to wildlife. Imagine my shock. And they argued, and to their credit, they argued that, public trust has been oriented toward water and streams. And that is true, it is oriented toward water and streams, but the whole thing is built around a larger version of the public trust. It isn't just about our ownership of water, it's our ownership of air and the landscape and the wildlife that moves across the landscape. So if we can't trust our department, and I still believe we can and should, because there's a lot of great people on the ground, and many of you dedicated your whole professional careers to the agency and doing the work, we have to make sure we hold our trustees accountable. So the public trust is the foundation of where we go in the future. The other thing I mentioned is habitat, just because without healthy habitat, we can't have healthy wildlife. And I appreciated Alyssa's conversation about beaver, because essentially beaver are one of the keystone things that make habitat, not just for fish or for beavers or for amphibians, but for waterfowl, for wildlife, all that depend on riparian areas surrounded around that water that we also all own. The habitat focus is important because it speaks more loudly about ecology, right? It's not just about do you guys remember Vince Hammond? He was a great spokesperson for FWP for a long time. And Vince used to say, everything on this earth needs clean water, fresh air, and a place to live, and food. And really, those essential things are what Montana's shift to focusing toward habitat makes a lot of the difference to reinstall the wild process in wildlife management, right? It's like the wild fish, wild trout. It's a whole different ball game when you're dealing with focusing on a healthy river and clean water than it is poking in unwild hatchery fish. And we realize that that's not just about better fishing, it's also about more resilient watersheds. For example, whirling disease mows through the Madison. It would have been really easy for Montana to go, oh, that's okay, we'll just stock them. We'll put them back in, we'll all be fine, we'll have plenty of fishing. But that wouldn't have been essentially, that would have lost the wild ingredient. And the wild ingredient is big because we saw what happened to that, especially rainbow trout population in the Madison. They surged back. After a pandemic, they adapted. We opened up tributaries and other places for them to spawn to obey the parasite, and they responded. There's a resiliency built in when you have healthy populations based in a healthy habitat. The other aspect of habitat to think about, and the public aspect of it, is we have extensive public lands in Montana, which sets us apart from many states. But if we all just stood at the boundary in the forest and looked up at the wilderness or the wild country in the forest, we'd be missing out on probably 80% of the wildlife habitat, either seasonal or year-round habitat. And in Montana, what we've done is we haven't just focused on that public land element. We focused on cross-jurisdictional wildlife management. And that expansive view of habitat across the landscape has rewilded, or in a sense, helped us create an atmosphere where we could recreate healthy wildlife populations regardless of land ownership. And it means we have to respect the landowner, we have to respect the rancher, and how wildlife can cause problems and also give benefit to a given landowner. And I think we've done that expertly. We've developed dozens of tools to help improve habitat on private land. We've got dozens of tools to address game damage problems on private land. And we've done that because essentially we're willing, as the owners, as conservationists of the wildlife, to work with people and meet them where they are. And I think, many of you have been around Montana as long as me. I don't think that's always been the case. We've improved grazing practices, timber practices. Think about our elk logging study that was done by the universities and the department back in the 70s and 80s. This was a time where, from my house in Belgrade at the time, I could look up at a 640-acre clear cut on Wheeler Mountain on public land. And the whole Gallatin Face at that time was a series of very large clear cuts. And each clear cut had miles of road. In Denny Creek down at Hebgen Reservoir, Denny Creek had 10.2 miles of road per mile throughout much of that drainage. And so what our scientists taught us, which brings me to the third point, is following the science, is that it isn't just about not cutting down trees, it's about not providing or stripping a landscape of security cover, both thermal cover and also high security cover. And so through science, we woke up to the fact that, oh, if we take care of the landscape, we'll take care of habitat. And now we're in a position where much of that regrowth over 30 years ago, 40 years ago, is back to the point where timber management might be a good idea. It's not a bad idea, but we know better than a 640 acre clear cut. And we know better than 10 miles of logging road per mile and the devastation that could cause on our fisheries and our stream and our watershed health. But we still need to focus on the ability to manage that habitat, whether it's forest, state ground, or private ground. We can do this. And we know that the result of much of that hyper timber harvest in the Hebgen Basin was it created a lot of habitat for browse and improved our mule deer and our moose populations to some extent. But we also know that we can't restore grizzlies if we have a heavily eroded atmosphere. We need food, water, and a place to live. And part of that is security. So shifting to the third, from habitat to science, science isn't a panacea, right? It isn't all the good things. It was science that drove the idea in 1954 that we'll put DDT in these bombers and reemploy some of these pilots from Korea, and we'll fill the tanks with DDT. And we sprayed everything from Yankee Jim Canyon, if you know the Paradise Valley area. From Yankee Jim, it was sprayed throughout the entire watershed, all the way up to Pebble Creek near Cook City, to kill off spruce budworms. So science was driving this. Well, also science learned a few things. If you spray DDT across an entire watershed, your fish starve to death, because you didn't just kill off the spruce budworm, you killed off stoneflies and mayflies and sandflies and pollinators and all kinds of things. So the fish were literally all the way down to big timber, were dying of starvation. And there's a great DJ report about this, where they cut open the bellies to see what they were eating, and they're packed with filamentous algae, trying to survive on algae. You know, trout trying to survive on algae is not a great way to survive. So science brought us that, but it also made us realize that we didn't just kill off the trout, we killed off dippers, mink, otter, ospreys, who couldn't lay eggs because of the DDT, incidentally. We killed off a whole ecosystem, trying to target one thing. And so again, that breadth of habitat, the breadth of understanding the interconnectedness of wildlife and its habitat has emerged now. And that's where I think we need to keep that going forward. We don't know everything about wildlife. We have so much more to learn, and we have so many new tools at our disposal. When I first started, I was on the forefront of genetics, and we collect 10 fish, or 50 if the geneticist would rather have 50 fish and 10 fish, and you'd send them off to Rob Leary and over in the trout and salmon lab in Missoula, and they grind them up and take different parts, and they put them on a gel electrophoresis and run them through. And about 12 to 18 months later, you get the results saying, well, these are 98% cutthroat and 2% rainbow. Well, nowadays, they take a little fin clip and they drop it in a vial and put it in a machine, and literally within hours of the sample being run, you can have a genetic fingerprint for this population or this species. We could take grizzly bears, and now we can know exactly what their parentage is. Where did this sow come from? Where did this cub come from? We can trace it back with technology that we've never had. So we have so much more to learn, that if we're going to go into the future, we have to rely on well-trained field people, well-trained biologists, public and private, to give us the answers to the questions that we can resolve. We can't sacrifice science for politics. We can't sacrifice the public trust for profit. Those are the recipes for turning the clock back and going back the other direction. So that's all well and good. But let's bring it kind of more into the rational or the tangible space. What policies can we do to implement this? Well, first, making sure the public trust is the foundation. How do we do that? What's a really tangible way to do that? First, make sure the public has access to its wildlife across jurisdictional boundaries. Use the tools that we've developed, and let's be inventive and develop more tools to make sure that our owners of that wildlife, Montanans, can have that intimate relationship with wildlife, which is then what spurs us to conserve them beyond our own interests and into next generations. Preserve that. I think part of that notion is, in a very practical sense, what are a few things that we can do policy-wise to ensure that relationship continues on into the future. And I start with that a tag, a permit, a stamp is issued to a real live person. It's issued to you in your name and for your use only. And what we're seeing is kind of and across the West, is a tendency to start giving tags out in bundles to industry. And when we lose that personal contact, that personal ownership of that tag, and we start to sell those tags in a market sense or hand it to the commercial interests to start selling those tags, we're going to lose that essential element. It becomes not the king's wildlife and we as sovereigns, but a corporate wildlife. That is one of our biggest dangers. It's not a huge lift. In fact, the law is based on that theory that tags are issued to individuals. Now, that's not to say we can't honor landowners' contribution to wildlife and issue tags. These elk habitat or elk access agreements that are very emerging in popularity aren't necessarily a bad idea. I was dead set against them at first. I see that they did result in some access for public, but it needs to be constrained. That landowner who agrees to let 3 people on for every tag he or she gets has a name attached to those tags. It doesn't go to the Rand Corporation owner of this big ranch. It goes to an individual. So individual issuance of tags to real persons, whether they're resident or non-resident. That's another issue, is the balance between the owners and of the wildlife, and the non-resident visitors. We all have relatives and friends that we love to hunt with that we bring to Montana. I don't want to take that away. I don't want to take the economic benefit that non-residents do. They pay their freight, both in funding our conservation operations, and they also help out the small town businesses. It's good for the economy. But there has to be a line drawn. And I don't know if it's 10 or 15 or 16 or 40%. I think it should be around 10 to 15% of any tag issued should be limited to non-residents, should be limited to a smaller fraction of that. I think the other part about allocation is we're reaching a point where our population is growing to the point where we have to start thinking about allocating tags, not just between residents and non-residents, but even among residents. Well, we've done it for years. We do it for mountain goats and sheep and goats, and someday before I die, I might actually draw a moose. But we already allocate that. We allocate our elk tags too. You know, I keep applying for 380 because someday I'm going to go back to my old hunting grounds and get one of those big bulls just south of Helena. But we're going to have to start thinking about allocation in a different way. I think the Madison is a good example, the Madison River fishery, where we had 5 petitions, 3 work groups, all coming up with great ideas. We had 89% of the outfitters who actually had permits to outfit on the Madison agree that we could cap commercial use at a given level. And part of that was we had to think about capping the other 75% of the use too. So I could get up any morning, I can run out to the Madison, fish for an hour, get back in time for work. That is a luxury that I've enjoyed my entire life here in Montana. At some point, I'm going to have to cut back, right? at some point, I'm gonna have to realize that I can't fish these highly popular areas every day. I can be driven off by the crowds, which is happening, but I can also be driven off or allocate my time and be willing to share that resource to protect it. Because we're seeing the signals that overfishing is actually impacting the population. People don't want to talk about it, but I've dug deep in the data. You don't have to trust me, I'll provide you the data yourselves. But the population is suffering from over-allocation, and it isn't harvest. It's all about hook and release mortality, changing the population health. If it crashes, everything crashes around it, right? And the same holds true for wildlife as well. We the commission, and with authorization from the legislature, dumped billions of tags, extended the season. We have 6 months of elk seasons now. You could get up to 3 elk tags. And did it actually do anything to change the populations? It didn't. Why? Well, because you can't just put a bunch of tags on the ground and crowd the public land and exclude big chunks of private land. It just doesn't work. More tags doesn't mean more harvest. At some point, we shift the behavior of these elk herds to the point where they're not accessible or and almost unmanageable. So we have to be inventive about that, about allocation. Be wiser that maybe we might have to limit some opportunities in certain places to address problems. Let science drive that. Let our biologists make the recommendations. And on science, I think when I came up through the ranks at FWP, we had this great research program going on. It was intimately associated with both universities, generating great research that was management, practical applications on the ground. Elk logging study, the mule deer study across the state, just innumerable great science that helped inform our management decisions. I think we need to get back to that. We need to get back to raising great scientists of both good programs at U of M, MSU, good programs, but we need to tie back that research into our management scheme here in Montana. I think that's a critical point. I'm gonna wrap it up. I could probably go on and on for hours until everybody's asleep, but I'll end with a quick hunting story. My favorite hunt ever, it was a Tuesday. I had 2 young boys, 2 and 4. I think it was a Veterans Day, so I think I had the day off. But the kids got them to daycare. My wife got them to daycare, but she had a conference, so I had to be back by 2:30 to pick up the kids. And it was one of those days where, okay, I got this much time. I'll leave before, I go dark 30. I only have to go 25 miles to get to public land where there's this honey hole. It's deep and dark timber. Not too many people go in there. It's steep and nasty. And on that day, the snow was just dumping and the wind was howling back and forth. There was no consistent wind pattern to pattern myself. And yet, in spite of that, the trees are popping. Like, when you move your hand line around, irrigation, it pings. That's what the trees were pinging. So it's loud and obnoxious. And I spotted a patch of elk hair through the deep, dark timber. And I plopped down on my rump and started heel walking, in the snow, heel walking down toward where I could get a window and see it. And sure enough, out of the gap in the trees, about 60 yards away, I could see the eye. And then it turned and I could see a brow tine, legal bull on public land 25 miles from my house. And the thing waited, and finally a swirl came around. It got my wind, it stood up, and I punched one through a hole in the timber about this big, right through the Boilermaker. And I had at 9:30 in the morning, I had my bull for the year. And I'm not one of those guys that gets a bull every year. In fact, I'm probably every 4 to 6 years when I get a bull. And then I had 5 hours to get this elk out. My truck was 6 miles over the top of the hill. And so I, broke it down, got it as close to the road as I can, bust my ass over the mountain, down to my truck, and picked up the kids at daycare a little bit late. But that's always expected. Anyway, that is the ultimate wild experience, right? I'm just an average Joe driving out first thing in the morning. Happens the weather and everything collides. Great habitat, a wild elk that lives in a place if you know the Gallup face, it's probably the most overrun chunk of ground in Montana. It's got public access to, a little over the top. And these have to have PhDs. I mean, I rarely get to see them up there, but I got one. So the ultimate experience, the ultimate wild, contrast that with shooting birds released the night before. That's the essential element. How do we maintain that? Let's focus on the public trust. Make sure the public is deeply engaged, just like all of you are. Stay engaged, hold our agency, hold our leaders accountable for our wildlife, focus on good science, and keep our focus on habitat. And don't let us slip back to the days where we could just stalk our way out of it, whether it's hatchery pheasants or hatchery rainbows. If we turn back and head back that way, we'll lose this treasure that we've all been involved in creating. So thank you so much. Hope I did you proud, all my professors out there.
Very much.
Anybody have any questions for Pat? All right, thanks, Pat. That's great.
Hello, everyone. Again, Frank Celesti. I'm the Executive Director of the Wildlife Federation. And Pat, Bruce, listen, let's give them one more round of applause. Bruce, thank you. Bruce, and also thank you for starting off our conference with really stimulating presentations and thoughts. It's going to continue. I have the great privilege of introducing our board chair, President of the Montana Wildlife Federation, Dr. Chris Servine of Missoula. He's prepared a presentation on grizzly bear management in Montana, the way forward. Chris retired in 2016 after 35 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he served as the agency's first and only grizzly bear recovery coordinator. In that role, he oversaw the management of grizzlies across the lower 48 states, including the greater Yellowstone, northern Continental Divide, Cabinet Yaak, Selkirk, and the Bitterroot areas. Chris has also worked on bear management issues around the world, including chairing the IUCN SSC Bear Specialist Group for the past 12 years. Chris earned a PhD from the University of Montana, where he continues to work as an adjunct professor of wildlife conservation. A couple of weeks back, Chris was asked to serve or to testify in front of a United States House committee on grizzly bear management, where he comported himself well and enlightened our members of Congress from across the country. And so without any further ado, Dr. Chris Servine.
No, I didn't pay him to say that. He did it all on his own. All right. We've certainly had some great speakers this morning, and I will try to keep up with all those good talks here. I want to tell you a story this morning. The story starts with when Europeans arrived in the West, and grizzly bears were one of the species that people didn't like, and they went to great lengths to try to kill all the grizzly bears, and they did a pretty good job. In the 1970s, the grizzly bears were listed as a threatened species, and we began to fix the things that we had done. And grizzly bears came back, and they are doing pretty well today. But unfortunately, at the end of the story, it looks like we may be going backwards. And this is a C.M. Russell painting, and the name of the painting is Ropes and Swift Horses Are Surer Than Lead, and the objective here is to kill the bear, right, one way or another. So, okay, so 4 things happen to fix the Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide. NCDE means the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, basically the Bob Marshall Glacier complex. We did mortality control. We increased habitat security. We increased sanitation, got rid of garbage, and made people be more clean in the woods and not dump garbage out there. And we built public understanding and support of grizzly bears. And back then, when we started that process, there was a lot of concern about grizzly bears, and the public in general was pretty interested in fixing the ways that grizzly bears had been disturbed and eliminated for so long. And then we had pretty good success. You know, what is necessary to get across the finish line, which is called delisting. You know, when a listed species is out there, you do things to fix them, and when you reach the recovery level, then you can delist them and take them off the list. Well, to achieve delisting, you need sufficient habitat, and the Fish and Wildlife Service must figure out if that's the case. You have to have sufficient population numbers, which are set in the recovery plan. And you have to have adequate regulatory mechanisms in place so that when you pull the Endangered Species Act rug out from underneath the grizzly bears, that they still stay healthy without the Endangered Species Act. So what does delisting not mean? It does not mean that you drive the populations down after delisting. It does not mean that you reduce numbers and range immediately upon delisting. It does not mean that you walk away from conflict reduction efforts, particularly outside recovery zones. And it does not mean that you allow new killing mechanisms on the landscape that are going to result in dead bears. So many people think that delisting only requires a certain number of animals as required by the Species Recovery Plan. And I heard this when I went back to Washington to testify in front of that House committee. I was told repeatedly by several of the congressmen that we had enough bears and therefore we should delist them. But just the numbers of bears is not just what you need. You need adequate mortality and habitat management mechanisms in place to assure that once you take them off the Endangered Species Act, they don't start to slip backwards. And people tend to forget the need for adequate regulatory mechanisms. And certainly those congressmen in that room in Washington, D.C. had never thought about the idea of adequate regulatory mechanisms. All they thought was you just had enough bears, now let's just delist them. So are adequate regulatory mechanisms in place now to control mortality, to make sure the habitat is still going to be there in the future? And the answer is no. So an example of some of the inadequate regulatory mechanisms that are out there, some of them relate to public land and how public land is managed. I'll use the Flathead Forest as an example of the way public land should not be managed. The Flathead Forest seems bound and determined to take a small lodge on public land on Holland Lake and expand it by 35,000 additional user days per year. And to do this in prime grizzly bear habitat, despite the fact that they've agreed that they were not going to do such things. And if that takes place, then the grizzly bear will not be able to be delisted. And that's been told to the forest supervisor, and he continues to do what he's doing today. So we have another example of inadequate regulatory mechanisms related to state legislation. Recently, in 2021, the Montana State Legislature mandated the use of neck snares to trap wolves in grizzly bear habitat when grizzly bears and black bears were out of the den. They allowed the use of hounds to hunt black bears in Montana in areas occupied by grizzly bears. Hound hunting of black bears in Montana had been illegal since 1921. That's 100 years until that was put in place by the 2021 legislature. The use of hounds to hunt black bears in grizzly bear habitat will result in conflict and death for grizzly bears. And then they allowed the use of bait around wolf traps and neck snares. And bait, of course, will attract forest carnivores, grizzly bears, black bears, and many other forest carnivores, and they will be tracked and neck snared as they are attracted to this bait. Now, we know that grizzly bears can be caught in wolf traps, despite some people saying, well, they won't, and that trappers know how to avoid catching grizzly bears. That's not really true. These traps do catch grizzly bears, black bears, and other things. And if you trap these animals with bait when the bears are out of their den, you will catch grizzly bears and black bears. And there are multiple examples of this happening. And this isn't good for the bears. Oftentimes, you know, if you're not a professional, you will not be able to get that bear out of that trap. And the only way to deal with that situation is to kill the bear. And if you kill the bear, then you're probably not going to tell people that, because that might mean that people wouldn't want you to trap wolves anymore around grizzly bear habitat, so you're probably not going to talk about it. And grizzly bears and black bears will be caught in wolf neck snares that are set for wolves. And that happens. This is a grizzly bear that is wearing a wolf neck snare. He chewed the end of the snare off and was carrying it around. Hound hunting is a really incompatible activity in grizzly bear habitat. Hound hunters have no way of knowing what their hounds are chasing until they arrive at the scene and find their hounds being killed by a grizzly bear, or they encounter a grizzly bear that is being chased by hounds. And the grizzly bear is not going to be very safe to be around when that is happening. And it's important to note this is the real minority of people that use these techniques. So we put this hound hunting of black bears on the landscape for less than 2% of the black bear hunters in Montana. There's about 560 perhaps that hunt with hounds, and about 150, maybe 200 of those are out-of-state hound hunters that come to Montana now to hound hunt black bears. And this incentive issue, you know, it's very difficult to know if these things happen, because hound hunting and conflicts with grizzly bears happen away from the public view. And oftentimes it's going to be a tangle, and there's every incentive not to report, because if there were reports of grizzly bears being killed because of hound hunters, then it might be that hound hunting would be stopped. And so the incentive of the hound hunters to report is pretty low. Another thing is that regulatory mechanisms should be permanent. Once they're placed out there, they should remain. Regulatory mechanisms should not be a temporary thing to be used by state agencies or legislatures to get the species delisted, and once delisting is achieved, to eliminate or reduce these regulatory mechanisms. This is what we're seeing with wolves now. Is state legislative wolf management a premonition of future grizzly bear management in Montana? Well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that if grizzly bears were delisted and turned over to state management, with the current attitude toward predators that we have in the legislatures and the governors, and I use two because I'm talking about Idaho and Montana, these legislators and governors would probably do the same thing to grizzly bears that they're currently doing to wolves. They would try to legislatively minimize grizzly numbers inside recovery zones and eliminate grizzly bears outside recovery zones. And they would probably start to do that as soon as federal control disappeared. So the only thing that's preventing that from happening now is that the grizzly bears are still listed. So what do we need to actually do to have in place to actually get grizzly bears delisted? Well, we need to prohibit hound hunting of black bears anywhere grizzly bears are present, period. And that's basically all of western Montana. We need to confine wolf trapping and snaring to the time that grizzly bears are in the den. That's January 1st to February 28th. Almost all the bears are in the den during that time period. And the wolf trappers and snarers could be out there doing their thing. And they will not be killing grizzly bears and black bears. We need to eliminate laws and policies that promote intolerance and the killing of non-conflict bears. And in the draft state management plan that was released by Montana, there is a section in there on how grizzly bears that are non-conflict bears, both on public and private land, can be lethally removed just because they exist. That is also in this recent bill, Senate Bill 295, that is on the way to being approved by the state legislature. It's really unfortunate that the legislature is pushing things like this. They've been told repeatedly that this type of thing is going to be dangerous to bears. It's going to eliminate the possibility of delisting grizzly bears, and yet they do it anyway. It's important to continue and expand the emphasis on conflict reduction programs, allowing people to understand how they can live with animals like grizzly bears, helping them do that with electric fencing and education and outreach. And that should happen everywhere where grizzly bears are present. Another thing that needs to be done is do not issue permits to the public to kill bears that they think may be threatening them or threatening their livestock. Threatening is a non-defined term. We're not worried about bears that are actually doing it, and in fact, we support the idea that if somebody has a bear in the act of killing livestock, he's able to kill that bear. That's okay. But just to saying, I think that bear is threatening my livestock, here's a permit, you give this guy a permit. This bill, SB 295, will give private landowners a permit to kill grizzly bears. There's no limit on how long that permit lasts or where that permit can be used, or any limits on like night shooting bears. So in some cases, these guys are going to be driving around with spotlights looking for bears to shoot them. And that's going to result in wounded bears, of course. And in many cases, it will not be the right bear because bears move across the landscape and you can't give somebody an after the fact permit. 2 days later, they're going to be out there grizzly hunting and they're going to shoot the first bear they see because most people can't tell one bear from another. So it's just a crazy system to give people permits like that. The way to manage bears, which they should be managed if they're in conflict, is the state bear managers, not private individuals with permits. We need to minimize mortality in the connectivity areas between ecosystems. It's important that the bears eventually have connectivity between the systems, and here's the wolf management plan map. The light blue areas here are the areas open to wolf trapping and snaring the first Monday after Thanksgiving. And hound hunting of grizzly bears occurs in many of these places too. The first Monday after Thanksgiving, perhaps 30% of the bears are still out of the den. So these maps, here's a map of radio-collared bears right here in this area right here that's open to wolf trapping and snaring and hound hunting. Here's a map of the distribution of grizzly bear sightings in western Montana. There's a big cluster of them right here, and that's right in this area that's open to wolf trapping and snaring and hound hunting. So, you know, when you have this in place, what you have is an inadequate way to regulate mortality. You're putting all these mortality sources right on top of the bears. This map is a projected modeled map of grizzly bear connectivity between the Bitterroot ecosystem, which is down here, and the northern continental divide ecosystem, which goes right around Missoula and Lolo right here. And these darker colors are the most likely places for bears to move. You know, produce this map and this model, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So their own model shows them that this is a place where grizzly bears should be moving for connectivity, and yet they're putting these mortality sources right on top of them. And that's this year. The intention of post-delisting habitat management is to maintain the habitat baseline on public lands. Habitat baseline was what was out there when the grizzly bears achieved their recovered status. You have to maintain that level of habitat in order to maintain that recovered population. The Forest Service and the Park Service agreed to this in writing in both the Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem in what are called these post-delisting management plans, called the conservation strategies. The Flathead Forest, using them as an example, they are completely ignoring this idea of the habitat baseline by taking this lodge on public land and expanding it into this massive four-season resort with 35,000 additional user days per year on Hog Lake in public land, on public land in prime grizzly bear habitat. This idea that recreation consumes habitat security is a really fundamental issue. The more people we put on the landscape, the more difficult it is for all wildlife to survive and be able to get by. And this cartoon, which is from Mountain Journal, is really telling, it says, and to solve the problem of our crowding, we need to disperse recreation into underutilized parts of the backcountry. No one's using it anyway. This is the number of non-resident visitors to Montana. 12 million a year. There's about 1 million Montanans. This means that for every one of us, there's 12 tourists that come to Montana each year. This has an effect. We can't just be whistling past the graveyard and say, well, we can just have lots of tourists and things will be fine. This will erode a lot of things. As more people come, they come here because they come to see the country, they come to go in the backcountry, they come to fish and hunt and all the things that are out there. They pressure wildlife everywhere they go. We pressure wildlife everywhere we go. And this pressure increases stress on wildlife and increases energetic demands, reduced survival of young, avoidance of preferred habitats, displacement into less secure habitats, and increased mortality risk. So every time we do things like this, particularly on public land, we create these pressures on animals. And has anybody ever seen this kind of thing happening, where, well, I saw this really great place and I'm going to put it on Facebook, or I'm going to tell everybody, I just went fishing in this place and the fishing was great. I think the people that do that are just idiots, right? But it's quite common that it happens, and then we get this kind of thing. Wow, I'm sharing this, it'll reach millions. We'll be right there. This is really common in the day of social media where people, have to kind of show how cool they are by telling everybody they went and they killed a big elk in this place, or they fished here, or they went hiking and they got into this really cool spot. And so not only do they have an effect, but they increase their effect by telling everybody else to come and do the same thing they did. It's really frightening what's happening in Montana right now. Look at these growth rates. Gallatin County has increased 42.77% since 2010. Flathead County has increased 19.2% since 2010. Where are all these people living? They're living on the edge of public lands. They're living in wildlife habitat. Look at this. This is building permits in Flathead County. In 2010, there were 69 multifamily housing permits in Flathead County. In 2021, there were 702. Single-family houses, there were 85 building permits in Flathead County in 2010. In 2021, there were 414. What happens when this happens? These people are building things in wildlife habitat. They're living in wildlife habitat, and then they go onto the public land out of that wildlife habitat, which happens to be private or used to be, and the effect on that adjacent public land is huge. Tell me one time that the Forest Service has ever done an analysis that shows when private land is developed next to the forest, that it's gonna compromise the resources in the national forest. Tell me one time when they've actually done that kind of, where they've taken into account this kind of land growth, this kind of development growth adjacent to public lands and what the forest can do about it. And then what can the forest do about it? So if the Flathead Forest approves this Holland Lake proposal, and many of the other things they're using, and I use the Flathead as an example because the Flathead is probably the #1 grizzly bear forest in the lower 48 states. Got more bears and more country than any other forest. And right now, it is the worst national forest in terms of its management of wildlife. Certainly its management of human recreation impacts on wildlife. So if this goes forward on the Flathead Forest, adequate regulatory mechanisms for habitat will not be in place and grizzly bears cannot be delisted. So the actions of the Flathead Forest in and of themselves will prevent grizzly bears from being delisted. That's not even talking about what's going on at the legislature. So this idea that we can go backwards in management once the grizzly bears are delisted is a common idea. People think, we can go back to the 70s, the way it used to be. As soon as the grizzly bears are off the Endangered Species Act, we don't have to worry about them anymore. And that's basically the attitude of the Flathead Forest. Since the grizzly bears are delisted here, we can do lots of things on public land. I'm paraphrasing what was stated by the forest supervisor. So delisting does not mean we can go back to the way things were. We can't keep recovered populations if we allow that to happen. So in summary, the laws that mandate anti-predator actions that kill grizzly bears must be eliminated in Idaho and Montana if we're going to delist grizzly bears. These things have to be limited in the time to where they occur, so the bears are in the den. And in some cases, the activities like hound hunting cannot occur at all in grizzly bear habitat. And the public lands must be managed to maintain the secure habitat that existed at the baseline level when recovery was achieved, which in most cases is about 2011, 2012. That means the levels of intensive recreational development on public land can't get any higher than that. That's the habitat baseline. The Forest Service agreed to that in writing. The Park Service did too. So grizzly bears have come a long way in 40 years. Can we keep them healthy after delisting? I don't know. I don't think they're going to be delisted right now. I think everything that I've showed you here indicates that adequate regulatory mechanisms are not in place and that it's not possible to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. Remember, the adequacy of regulatory mechanisms must be demonstrated under the ESA for a species to be delisted. So, any questions? Kathy?
Hey, Chris, you use the Flathead Forest throughout this talk, and you have mentioned that they have regulations that they have signed off on that will protect grizzly bear habitat. But then we see the recent actions that Holland Lake is in violation of those commitments. How do you enforce? What is the enforcement mechanism to get Flathead Forest to do what they committed to? Is there any options for citizens or groups like ours?
Well, that's an excellent question. When we build these post-delisting management plans, which are called the conservation strategies, that detail how the habitat baseline must be maintained by the public land management agencies. And then there's a signatory page on there. All the agencies signed that. Is there a legal recourse or a legal mechanism to get them to agree to what they signed off on? I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. I don't know. But I think the mechanism, the strongest mechanism is that grizzly bears cannot be delisted unless that is in place. And if the Flathead wants to do this, then they can own the fact that they are preventing the delisting of the grizzly bear. I think that's the strongest mechanism out there. In the court of public opinion, you know, why is it that we can't delist the grizzly bear? We got a lot of grizzly bears. What's the problem? Well, there's legislative problems of killing mechanisms that are uncontrolled, and there are habitat problems. Pond Lake is the prime example of that, but there are others too. And if those things are in place, the grizzly bear cannot be delisted. And it needs to be made public that that's what's going to happen. Tom?
Chris, the consultation process, that's still in place while the grizzly bear is listed. So in the case of Pond Lake or the proposal we're starting to see over at Helena Lake with expansion of the ski trails and the multi-year resort, won't that still have to go through a consultation process?
You know, the whole consultation idea is a great idea, except the idea that the only way you can stop a program on public lands is if it jeopardizes the existence of the listed species. That means the jeopardy has to be shown, and it's not going to be possible to say you could put in the Pond Lake Lodge. It's not going to jeopardize the continued existence of the NCDE grizzly bear population. And so consultation can be used to minimize things like, you know, maybe different roads in different places and timber sales and things, but no individual project on public lands is ever going to jeopardize the grizzly bear in an ecosystem. And therefore, the Section 7 has no teeth at all to prevent something from happening. And consultations on Pond Lake Lodge will not change the fact that they're going to put it in. Doug?
Yes, Chris, excellent talk. You made many parallels between wolves and grizzly bears. But one thing with wolves is social tolerance. And so a lot of people argue for delisting because it allows, I'm not talking about conflict management, I'm talking about hunting, but hunting increases social tolerance and acceptance of wolves in the landscape. Can you comment about that feeling in terms of grizzly bear management? I realize they're listed, but just generally that hunting leads to social acceptance. There's a big debate about that with wolves. Some argue yes, others argue no. I just wondered if you could reflect on that with grizzlies.
That's a great question. You know, it's interesting. If you look at wolves, wolves have been hunted and trapped in Montana, and since, I don't know, 2011, 2012, and the population has been stabilized with hunting and trapping to about, or since about 2012, according to Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And the take is somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 or so wolves a year, hunted and trapped during a legal season. And the population of wolves was stable. And yet the legislature and a bunch of constituents claimed that there were too many wolves and we didn't want the wolves anymore. And the hatred expressed toward wolves during the 2021 legislature was extraordinary. And many of those people that were expressing that were wolf hunters and trappers. And so I know it's hard for me to see that the hunting of wolves really increased social tolerance for wolves among the people that were hunting and trapping wolves. I mean, I find that hard to believe.
Do you predict the same thing will happen with grizzly bears?
Well, okay, first of all, I think that hunting grizzly bears is going to be an order of magnitude less than wolves. You know, if we had 100 grizzly bears, it would be probably in the neighborhood, let's say the NCDE, you're probably talking maybe, in the core area, you're probably talking maybe 10 or 15, and maybe outside it might be 50, I don't know, somewhere in that neighborhood. So let's say 60 bears. So, you know, would those bears and taking out those bears by hunter increase the tolerance of people for grizzly bears, social tolerance? I don't know, it's kind of hypothetical sociology and stuff here, you know? I mean, it's clear, there's clear data that shows that hunting does not reduce human-bear conflicts. hunting will not reduce human-bear conflicts. That is absolutely the case, and a lot of people think that it will. That if you hunt bears, there won't be bears, in people's backyards anymore, and there won't be bears killing livestock, and that is not going to happen. And there's multiple studies that show that you can kill animals in a hunt. It has no effect on the human-bear conflict in the same areas where the hunt occurs. Basically, you're not killing the bears that are in conflict, and bears don't learn anything from dying. And so, because bears are a solitary species by and large, they don't get the message when Frank disappeared, they're gone. Frank is gone, and you don't know where he went, but you don't be careful around humans because Frank is gone. The only way that hunting is going to reduce human-bear conflicts is to kill so many bears that the encounter frequency between humans and bears is minimal. And that means that you take the population down to almost none. That way, you can reduce human-bear conflicts by killing most of the bears, but that's not acceptable for other reasons. So to get back to your original question, will hunting increase social tolerance for people, for the general public? I do not think so. I think it's going to be real hard to think that that's the case. You'd have to really conjure up some stuff that really is baseless. So. Okay. Chris.
Would you talk about, because when we think about delisting, I think most people think that we're going to delist them in the whole state, but we're not. The delisting is going to be for a portion of the state. Would you, and talk about what portion would be delisted if that happens, and then what do we expect to happen in the rest of the state, which is mostly eastern Montana?
Okay, let's see if I can get back to this map here, wolf map. Okay, there's a proposal or a petition to delist the grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. That would essentially delist everything east of I-15 and south of I-90. So all of this area here. And it would go, I think on this end, the east end, it probably goes down over here, but it's everything east of I-15 and south of I-90 down to about here. That's the Yellowstone petition. The NCDE petition essentially goes down the edge of the NCDE down to I-90, which is about, let's see, that's Helena right over here. And then everything north of I-90 is delisted. And so all of this area would be delisted under the NCDE petition. This area out here is not included in the NCDE petition because there's no grizzly bears out there. But the area that proposed delist goes way over to Macomb County and everything across to the west edge, especially Highway 93 on the west side. So if both of those petitions were successful, you'd have everything west of I-15 up until I-90, and then everything south of I-90. So this whole area over here would still remain listed. And of course, the up until I-90, and then of course the Cabin Yak would still remain listed here. So it's hard to draw on this map that way, but think of I-15, everything west of that, everything south of I-90 from Missoula over, and then up and include the Cabin Yak.
That seems kind of weird because so much of that Idaho-Montana border has got all that. What happens on the Idaho side? Are they not looking at delisting that, or is that?
Well, Idaho petitioned to delist grizzly bears everywhere. So there's 3 different petitions. One was received from Wyoming to delist the Yellowstone ecosystem. One was received from Wyoming to delist the NCDE north of I-90. And the other one was from the state of Idaho. The Idaho petition was to delist grizzly bears everywhere because they should have never been listed. They said that grizzly bears, because they occur in Canada and Alaska in sufficient numbers, they don't need to be listed. And they were erroneously listed in the lower 48 states, and therefore everything should be zeroed out, and all the protections and all the details were gone. That petition was deemed to be unwarranted and was not accepted by the Fish and Wildlife Service.
when the petitions to delist grizzly bears were accepted by the Fish and Wildlife Service for consideration, all the cheering really drowned out the letter from Martha Williams, director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, to Hank Warsek, warning about the things that had to happen, and that's really unfortunate. And obviously, the Montana legislature is totally ignoring that. So, it's a really good roadmap that what needs to happen, and it ain't.
Yeah. And Director Williams did write a letter saying, there are problems associated with some of the legislation that was passed by the 2021 legislature, most of which I pointed out here, snares and hound hunting and stuff, and that this legislative session would be a good time to fix those errors. She said it in a real subtle way because the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't want to directly say to Montana, change your laws, do this, that, and that letter was completely ignored by Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the governor, and the legislature. So.
Just one more point. You point out the problems that the Forest Service deals with in the NCDE in dealing with managing around grizzly bears, but as you pointed out, Flathead County is growing very rapidly, and there's a situation developing right now. Bad Rock Canyon, through a work of a lot of people, was recently established as a WMA right at the mouth of Bad Rock, just out of Columbia Falls. And as you pointed out, a lot of these new people moving in want to live right next to that wild habitat. And right now, the city of Columbia Falls is considering a proposal to put in 114 residential units immediately adjacent to Bad Rock. And Columbia Falls doesn't have the mission or incentive like the Forest Service does to do that. And so we're building up some real problem. And grizzly bear tracking shows a lot of movement of bears right through the Bad Rock. So we got some bad situations setting up. The other thing I'll say is that unfortunately all these people moving out there all want chickens, and we're trading way too many chickens for grizzly bears. And I give a lot of credit to the management conflict specialists in trying to train people to protect your stupid chickens, but it's just we do that all the time, and it's a simple fix, and they cannot get it done.
Yeah, chickens are the new garbage.
Pardon?
If you look at the price of eggs lately.
Well, there is that.
So yeah, one last thing I'll just close with is that all these people moving into Montana and the development levels that I showed you here in the counties in grizzly bear habitat increases the importance of the management of public land, because public land is the only place these animals will be able to live. And all these people that are moving in here want to recreate on the public land. And how do we control that recreation? And the Forest Service doesn't have the ability or something to start grabbing this and saying, wait a minute, we can't really allow this. I mean, if you've ever been to Highlight Canyon out of Bozeman, look at what Highlight is. Highlight looks like Mammoth in Yellowstone National Park. I mean, it is just wall-to-wall people. You can't throw a friggin' rock without hitting a person in Highlight Canyon. And there's more and more of that pressure for people to be on the public land, and we can't expect the wildlife to live in these places to be successful as this pressure continues.
So the mechanisms are there. Somehow we have to give Fish, Wildlife and Parks and Forest Service the political will to enforce that, but lacking that, it's up to the folks in this room and elsewhere to hold up that part of the bargain.
And the forces of the apocalypse are on us with all the people coming to Montana.
Yeah.
We cannot pretend that Montana is going to be the way it is now with that level of development that's happening. It's changing, and it's really risky to the animals that live here and the things we value as Montanans. What are we going to do about it?
Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good, Chris. Thank you for that and for your advocacy and expertise. We are going to transition now to a working lunch for the MWF board and affiliates. Certainly the speakers are welcome. During the lunch, and it's up it's a public lunch. There's going to be a discussion and a vote on 14 policy resolutions, which have been previously sent to the board and affiliates. We have paper copies as well. We're also going to be, I think, putting up on the screen, Chris, the letter that you and Lisa and some others have drafted in defense. We mentioned U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director, Montana, Helena's own Martha Williams, and we're going to have a letter regarding her that we're going to be discussing. Mary, our aide-de-camp from Best Western Great Northern, who's been with me since 6:30, 7 o'clock this morning. Give a round of applause to Mary for being here so early. She is marking the boxed lunches. I'm going to ask that board and speakers and then staff grab a lunch. We'll certainly have a bio break here. There's lemonade, water, coffee, tea. I wasn't sure how many box lunches to order, so board and staff and guests grab lunch first. If there's food left over, certainly people are welcome to that, but there are places to get some food. We certainly don't want the folks who've walked in, grab a bite and then come back because we have an exciting afternoon. But let's take a 10-minute break, 15 tops, and get back for the working lunch. Chris has an additional point to make. Go ahead, Chris.
Just to remind everybody that we will have a panel of legislators that'll be here at 1 o'clock. And so we're going to have an hour to, interact with these legislators. So we want to be finished up by then. You're welcome to stay, as Frank said, but we're going to talk about these resolutions, some issues related to MWF board activities. And we'll have a working lunch here. So for those of you that don't want to be here for that working thing, you're welcome to go out and have lunch close by. There's a lot of good places. And come back at 1 so that we can hear our legislative panel. So take 10 minutes or so, walk around, and go to the bathroom, and get your lunch.
Very good, very good.
I'm like, oh my God, we should have gone out. Like, and that stretch.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Jim Bashro. So happy to make it here. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay.
I do want to introduce you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bring Eric.
Oh, gosh.
He would have enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he,
Yes, the water is.
Thank you so much. Get a little pause on that stream now, or what do you